Hello and welcome to podcast number 3 under the banner of UKGI Live. These sessions are all part of our move to launch more regular digital educational content that adds value to our existing services and client relationships. So these podcast chats and some of the 30-minute free webinar lunch and learn presentations, they all culminate in our face-to-face seminars, the next of which are being hosted on the 23rd of October at the Union Jack Club in London and on the 13th of November at the Heart of England in Coventry. More information about those seminars is available on our website. But today we're talking about operational resilience and risk management, and I'm joined by our CEO, Richard McKenzie.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, so I'm CEO of UKGI Group's Consultancy division. I've been in the business a little over 3 years now, and my background prior to this, 7 years training as an accountant with Deloitte. So lots of experience when I worked there within consumer credit, general insurance and other regulated sectors. And a real mix of ranging all the way from trainee accounting type roles, but through to internal audit, through to risk and governance. So a lot of exposure to various firms through that period. Some of those very large corporates, some of those in distress as well. So a good chance to help firms who'd really struggled with various aspects of regulation, and some of those very strategic projects, helping them with future business plans and how risk and regulation can fit into that. So hopefully well placed to be able to contribute to today's podcast.
We know that operational resilience has been an area of interest for the FCA for some time, certainly since 2019 when it issued a consultation paper CP 1932. And that interest was further reinforced through some of the firm failures to recover from business interruptions during the pandemic back in 2020, not just in general insurance, but in other financial services sectors as well. But the resulting ramifications for customers that sat within those sectors. I think it's fair to say that operational resilience is now something that has cemented itself as a familiar phrase, not only synonymous with financial services sector, but other sectors more broadly. And following the FCA's policy statement, PS 21.3, where they looked at building operational resilience for insurance intermediaries, that created some rules, more for enhanced scope SMCR firms. But with the introduction of FIN 073, the Baseline Financial Resilience Report, which is now a staple in firms' reg reporting calendars, it perhaps creates an expectation for core SMCR firms to apply these mechanisms as guidance where they represent best practice in building resilient businesses. Businesses that meet the overarching operational objectives of the FCA to protect consumers, protect integrity within the market and the system, and to promote competition. And it's all clearly elevated through the introduction of the consumer duty, which for a change we're not going to focus on too much today. But in considering this approach to risk management, would you say this is a key step for firms, Richard, in bolstering their operational resilience?
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, this has been something that's been around for a long time. So, I mean, if you look at, as you say there, you've quoted, Dave, various things that have come out of the regulator in the last 6-7 years. I mean, ultimately, if you head back to the financial crash back in 2007, I mean, this is something that should have been in place well before that. I think firms have been playing catch up ever since, and so has the regulator. So risk management is not a new discipline. It's something that has been here for some time now. I think firms over years have got more mature and sophisticated in the way they approach this. But I guess answering the question, absolutely, this is fundamental to operational resilience. And I worked in a large regulated firm when the wind down planning questionnaire was first sent out, and it appeared a bit odd in a way in that the firm was being asked at that point in time about wind down at a point in time when actually the need for that particular organisation was greater than ever. It was a charitable organisation operating in the debt advice sector, which obviously, as you can probably appreciate, during COVID at that time, was more than prevalent. But the questions being asked, and I guess some of the principles that were being tested, were things that were well embedded within that business at the time. I guess COVID was a really good example of where although firms in various ways and guises had gone about risk management and control environments, control frameworks, ensuring the businesses were sustainable and not just financially sustainable. COVID really tested firms and actually proved in various cases that some of these plans around operational resilience, wind down, risk and control frameworks, governance frameworks were put to the test, and many failed. And many firms found ways to continue and to become more resilient, but actually there were glaring emissions and glaring failures within what should have been reasonably robust risk management frameworks at that point in time. So
yeah, for the general insurance sector, there was some key examples of firms that failed when there was perhaps no perceivable reason that they should have suffered to the level that they did. And I think that's probably why there's been such a move to focus on this from the FCA. And that's why we see, as part of, any firm's regulatory business plan, even at the authorisations gate, there's a requirement to already have in place that plan for orderly wind down. So operational resilience is very firmly stamped into, firms' approaches to business, isn't it? Or should be.
It is, and it should be. And I think naturally, if you consider it, firms are very focused on forward strategy, objectives, what they're trying to achieve now and in the future. And I think to an extent, there's a head in the sand moment where some of these larger failures or control breakdowns or systems or framework breakdowns, although they're possible, I think they're perceived as unlikely, and therefore is enough resource and effort and time and focus put on to ensuring robust risk management. Probably not historically. I think more so now, but certainly not to the level across the board where the regulator would expect firms to be. I mean, the requirements are a reasonably high level within the CISC handbook around this, and there are lots of ways of going about it, which we'll come to talk about today. But I think maturity around risk management does support strategy. It should start there. And if firms can find a way of threading in the risk management framework into the business plan, business strategy, then the two things should run in parallel, really, rather than be an afterthought. Ultimately, in my view, Dave, this is where, going all the way back to your Enron failures back in the early 2000s, where, I think these were well publicised over the pond, but actually, firms over this side, outside of the financial crash, probably thought these weren't the sort of things that would ultimately impact them. And, COVID, as we've mentioned just now, although pandemics were planned for to an extent, I think clearly the response mechanisms that should have been there weren't. And therefore, the longer term impact and effect of that is still being felt. So yes, this is something, in my view, and I think in many practitioners' view, this is something where risk management could have helped manage the impact, certainly couldn't have stopped it happening, but would have helped firms manage the impact and how they respond to these wider key risks that have crystallised.
Absolutely. I think with your mention of the CISC sourcebook there, it's prompted me it's a question I'm probably going to start asking guests on these podcasts is what's your favourite handbook, area of the handbook, but I know that is your favourite sourcebook from within the FCA handbook, so I won't ask you that question today. So you're definitely a subject matter expert on the topic of risk management, and I know that firsthand from some of the sessions that we've delivered to support clients together. But in your words, I really like your explanation. What do we mean by risk management, and why is it a good idea?
Yeah, so risk, I mean, just to start with the high level principle around risk management, because it can become quite theoretical risk management. I think this is where firms that I've worked with over the years have probably failed to adopt it properly, and that's because they sit with the theory and not the practice of it, so they never see the benefit from risk management. And if you start with the concept of the fact that you manage all risk to zero, as far to zero as possible, so actually risks don't crystallise, don't become live issues. The mindset's wrong if you're starting in that frame of mind. The point of risk management is, and I'll come to the definition of this, but risk management is about understanding how much risk you're willing to take in order to achieve objectives. So it's not about limiting a firm's objectives or strategy or business. It's not about managing it close to zero. This is about understanding risk and understanding risks that face a particular firm, because every firm will be different. There might be similarities between firms and types of risk and categories of risk, but actually every firm is different. Therefore, understanding the risks that face that firm is really important. But just coming back to the definition of risk, and just before I get into the more technical definition, the view on risk has always been, going back maybe a decade, 15 years, that risk is a negative thing. It's an unwanted thing. It's something that will always have a negative impact on the business. And actually, if you look at the progression or the maturity of the risk definition over years, there is acceptance now and probably understanding that risk can actually bring opportunity as much as it can, an adverse impact. Now, obviously, you can get both, and often the lens is that risk is negative. But if you turn to ISO 31000, which is probably, I think, the most relevant definition of risk, it defines it as the effect of uncertainty on objectives, whether positive or negative. So the anchor word there is uncertainty. It's not about adverse impact. It's not about negativity. It's not about things going wrong. It's just uncertainty. It's the unknowns. Because if a risk was known, it'd be an issue, quite simply. And this is about the things that you don't quite know about that might impact you or a firm achieving what it wants to achieve.
So I think you've used this phrase before: a risk could be a threat to operations, or it could be an opportunity. And it's the mechanisms you've got in place to identify and treat that risk. And then that would denote, in line with your culture, how you respond to it.
It is, yeah, and the opportunity could be doing something new or different. So it could be a new product line. You might have a certain range of services or lines of business, and the opportunity around launching into a new product could itself bring risk, but it also brings opportunity. It brings ability to grow the business, to do things differently. But understanding the risk of that opportunity helps you, I guess, manage that or implement that new service or product in a way that brings success rather than failure.
Yeah. What are some of the key types of risk? If we stick with, some of the risk management definitions, what are the key things that firms should be looking at? What are the key types of risks that could pose themselves to firms?
So lots of ways to classify this. Some pretty common terms in there that I've tended to use in the past, which become quite normal. But you do start with negative or harmful risks. So these are the things that, if they crystallise, if they go wrong, they hurt a firm. Now that could be reputationally, they could hurt you. They could hurt you financially. Obviously, the regulator could therefore be involved if they're aware of a risk that's crystallised that has a negative impact. And that was the old-fashioned, most common definition of a risk. And ultimately, I guess the ultimate sanction from a risk that crystallises that is negative is the inability to therefore trade as a regulated entity. So for the firms that we work with, Dave, that does lead to an orderly wind down, as you mentioned right at the start of the call. That's the ultimate impact of that. And we've seen it happen. We've seen firms being told to cease trading, and that's the time when you wind down to a point of closing the doors. That's the ultimate negative impact here, outside of fines and censure,
Which could be against the firm or individual senior managers of the firms as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen both sides of this. I've seen individuals be fined and banned from being a director or operating in a regulated role. So yes, individual impact therefore is great, but I've seen firms as a whole be closed down, be ceased to trade through regulatory intervention, and obviously that impacts everyone in the firm. So it could be both sides of the coin there.
Absolutely. I like listening to you speak on this topic, and I know firsthand that you can speak at length about risk management. I know that we've delivered sessions that have lasted in excess of 3 hours, and equally I've seen you condense it into, did we manage 39 minutes on one occation? Risk management,
that was the record, 39 minutes, which was whistle stop to say the least, but gave a good overview of it.
Absolutely. And perhaps it's hard to summarize because we're just talking through this today, but what are some of the key principles of good risk management, and in particular risk culture? Culture being such a key driver for harm, as the FCA have identified within firms. What are some of the good risk management, good risk culture principles?
Yes, I've seen various examples in really large corporates, all the way down to small brokers and intermediaries that I've worked with over the years. I'll probably pick out half a dozen briefly, if I can, Dave, just to give an indication of things that I've seen that can work across all types of firms, all sizes of firms. Key thing for me is starting with tone at the top. So risk can't be owned from the shop floor upwards. This has got to be set from board level down, or director level down, or senior manager level down. That doesn't mean you need a fully fledged risk committee, the governance structures that sit with that, but you need buy-in at the top. And if the tone at the top's right, then that permeates down through a firm, through the organisation. Then from that, clearly you have embedded levels of accountability and ownership through the firm. But if your top people don't buy into what you're trying to achieve with risk, then the whole thing is set for failure from the start.
Yeah.
I'd say tone from the top. Various FCA publications have supported this over the years, not just in risk management, but in various elements of regulation. So start with tone at the top. The next one for me is proportionality. So there is no one size fits all approach to risk management. I think if you've got a regional broker trying to implement a banking risk management framework that's all bells and whistles and gets into things like capital adequacy and liquidity risk, market risk, it will never work. So it needs to be proportionate. I've seen some of the best risk management frameworks work on Excel spreadsheets. So the key thing for me here is to start the building blocks small and then build your risk management maturity over time. But to take a one-size-fits-all framework and try and crowbar that into any type of firm is the wrong way to go about it. And this is probably somewhere where a bit of advice, support, and whether that's that you bring somebody in with the right experience to help you do that, or you've got that experience or in the business, but you don't need to put a hell of a lot of time and effort and resource into this. You've just got to have the right experience and the right skill sets to help you build something that's relevant to the business that you work in and operate.
That's key. You've used some really key phrases there, making sure that it is relevant to the business that you run and operate, proportionality. We know that, having a robust risk management framework is going to increase a firm's chance of achieving business objectives, enable greater accountability at departmental level, policy level, or individual level, greater transparency and responsibility. And ultimately, it's going to improve outcomes for customers and markets. So a firm, particularly now in light of the Consumer Duty, and I promise we won't talk about it too much today because it's the hot topic of every conversation. But if a firm is able to demonstrate that it's made improvements to its risk management framework, that's one of the things they can sing about and should clearly have featured very heavily within the recent the Consumer Duty board reports that were signed off before the end of July this year. So it's an area that can benefit the business in so many ways, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And the key point there, you've already probably stolen my thunder on this one, Dave, but linking it to objectives is absolutely key. And this is where you bring the risk management framework to life. So if it exists in isolation to what a firm is trying to achieve and where it's trying to go, then it will always be in isolation. Therefore, you won't get the buy-in. So, you've always got to link the risks of the business to what the business is trying to achieve. And, the way we used to do this really is that when you're thinking about what risks the business faces, you start with what the business is trying to achieve, what its objectives are. So it sort of flows from top down that way. Then obviously, you've got to identify risks from the bottom levels up as well. But if you do it from both sides, then it brings it to life. It ties into making these choices that are more senior level, that are more relevant to what the risk management framework also tries to capture. So yes, linked objectives is my third. The fourth one is a bit of a trade secret, a bit of a giveaway. This really, and this is really where I see most firms fall down when they come to build risk management frameworks or approaches, or as most firms tend to start, they get an Excel spreadsheet risk register. They start to populate it and then wonder why 6 to 9 months later they're still messing around with the same spreadsheet. You've got to have the right framework, the right approach, and that always starts with a risk management policy. And that sets out a firm's approach to risk management, how it classifies risks, how it treats risks, definitions, and we get into quite complex areas like risk taxonomies. Well, risk language effectively is
the exciting stuff.
The really exciting stuff, but the important stuff, because it drives my fifth point here, which is consistency. Because if you've got different parts of a firm identifying risks, assessing those risks, treating them and reporting on them, if they do that in a very different fashion, the language is different, their assessment methodologies are different, you can never aggregate, you can never look at it in the round as a whole. And those inconsistent approaches to risk assessment make it very difficult to actually get something tangible out of the back end of the process. So aligned to the framework itself and how you articulate a firm's approach to risk management, consistency, therefore, of how you go about identifying, assessing, treating and monitoring the risks is really important. And then the fifth area for me is ownership and engagement. So we've talked about tone at the top and having a seat at the table. That forms part of the ownership piece for me. And I think that for me is moving away from risk management being tagged on to somebody else's job. Mm-hmm. Quite often you see where somebody has it thrown into the mix alongside lots of other things.
Usually the compliance function within a firm, isn't it?
Yeah, well, compliance on everything, compliance on regulatory products, implementing anything to do with regulation. Saw that with SMCR, where that was a compliance thing. Therefore, compliance can lead and actually no, it was a people thing, driven by senior management. So ownership is really important, but engagement, you've got to have engagement at all levels of the business. So we talked about senior management engagement, but it's got to thread throughout the business, and this is where how you engage people, it being part of a person's role. So something as simple as a risk champion. So that doesn't mean you've got a person sat as with a risk champion hat on and that's their only job. It never works like that. But if you've got defined accountabilities, defined roles within the business, it just helps set out who does what and why. So that's really important for me. The last point for me is structures. So depends on firm size. You got smaller firms where you'll not have an overly defined or robust structure around risk management. But I think with larger or medium-sized firms, you would expect a more formal governance structure around risk management, where you've got periodic papers that are reviewed by, can be a risk committee, can be an audit and risk committee, can be the board itself. But actually putting that into a structured format periodically drives a bit of a focus on risk management, ensures it gets its place in the agenda. Hopefully not at the end of the agenda, because I've seen that quite often where it's tagged right onto the back end of a board meeting. And the one thing I changed at one organisation I worked is that we started with people, We then went into risk management, and then the strategy and operational matters followed. And that's a really good marker for me of culture.
Yeah.
Not just cramming it into the last 5 minutes of a board meeting. And then therefore you get more time on it. You talk about the risks that might hurt the firm or the business, and you talk about the actions that you are going to are taking to address those. So that's my 6th point, Dave, there.
I think that's very, very succinctly and expertly explained there. I really like that. And I think it's a key point on accountability. Accountability is a phrase that's thrown about so often in relation to regulation and compliance, but that accountability has to resonate, like you say, from the tone at the top right the way down to, staff at the coal face. Like with the consumer duty, that topic I said we're not going to mention too much today. Everyone should be able to understand their role and their impact in relation to the consumer duty and good customer outcomes. The same should be true in relation to risk management. Each member of staff should understand how they can contribute to supporting a firm's risk management framework. And if that's something that firms are able to demonstrate and to bring into play, then I think they'll be making massive inroads into creating a resilient organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fundamentally agree.
So let's say we've got some senior leaders that are listening to this recording today, and we've piqued their interest. They're no longer questioning their life choices, and they realise that perhaps their approach to risk management is a little static. They have a risk register that's dusted off periodically, and there's work they can do to bolster their approach to risk management. What are some of the key next steps they can take, and how can UKGI support them?
Okay, you're going to like this sort of preamble to answer this one, Dave, I think, but avoid what I call the orange juice moment, if you remember that 1980s pop band.
Yes, I do.
So yeah, so I would suggest firms do what Orange Juice did, which was rip it up and start again. Certainly, most firms will have done something around risk management in the past. They can go from very immature to mature. Please don't start from scratch. I think what you've got's not good enough. Everyone's done something, and I think it's really useful to use that as your starting point. The first question to ask, and this is one I talked about in the 6 points previously, defining a proper risk management framework document is really important, because that will drive that consistency of approach. And we talked about proportionality earlier. I've seen really good ones that are 3-4 A4 pages long, and I've seen ones that are 40 to 50 pages. Please don't think that every firm needs to write 40 to 50 pages of a risk management framework. It doesn't need to be like that, but that structure needs to be there. Quickly skipping to your last question about how UKGI can help, but I will come back to answer this question in full. Engaging a third-party support with that is something that doesn't sit within the experience of the firm currently. It's something that we can help with. There are also some really good examples available externally through search engines, which might support, or I know organisations and trade associations sometimes publish good practice examples. But documenting a relevant but robust risk management framework is certainly the start. That needs to be approved by the most senior levels of the business. They need to buy into that. And as part of that, you would probably answer most of the next questions, which is about setting out in that document who is responsible and accountable for risk within the business, at what levels it's owned. It talks about the firm's general approach to risk management, which again is about accepting that risk is part of achieving business objectives. I've seen firms that are very risk averse, and actually that might be their approach to risk management, but most firms want to articulate that actually taking on risk is an everyday part of business operation. It sets that out. It sets out your approach to the identification, assessment, treatment, and monitoring of risk. It just drives that consistency. And the key thing here is that you can spend a bit of time writing a risk management framework. You then build it in blocks. So once you've got something that everyone's comfortable with and happy with, and senior management are fully supportive of, you then start to do it in blocks. And this is where a simple project plan probably works for me. You break it down into, this is like the large elephant eating in pieces, and you've got to break it down into small pieces and roll it out over a period of time. And that can be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, but in small pieces. So this is not 6 months, 2 years of solid work. This is starting to build forward your maturity in small elements. But you can base that on what you've already done. So if you've got a well filled out risk register, so you've spent time in the business identifying the risks, your categorization might not be quite what you'd want it to be versus your new risk management framework, but there's a basis there to revisit those risks, look at your scoring, look at your treatment, looking at whether you're bringing those risk scores down over time or not. So you can start off with one area of risk or one risk register, And then once you've proven that concept, you can then start to roll that out across other parts of the firm or different parts of the operation. But it is a continual improvement, continuous evolution thing. Rome certainly wasn't built in a day, so this is something that you start with a simple framework, and then you start to build it forward.
It's about the journey, not the destination, isn't it?
It is, and you'll never get to the end, because the outside world changes, business changes, the people change, approaches to risk management change and have changed. So it's a continually evolving process, and it matures along the way. And I think as firms start to see the benefits of risk management, as they do this, it starts to thread into part of the normal business cycle. So it becomes less of a project thing, as I was talking to you before, and more of actually it just forms part of how we do business.
Yeah, absolutely. BAU at that point. And, to jump into CISC, one of the key words in the FCA's expectations from CISC around however a firm chooses to identify, manage, monitor, and report on the risks it is or might be exposed to, it's the fact that they have to be effective. Because if those processes aren't effective, then falling short of the expectations of the FCA there, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, yeah. And just returning to your point about where UKGI can help, we've got a number of risk management professionals within our business, myself included. So we offer a wide range of services, but one of those is to support the firm on reviewing the risk management framework, helping them to build elements of it going forward, testing that risk management framework periodically, because that's a really important part of not just building something, but making sure it works periodically. So really any aspect of going from blank canvas, you've got nothing, all the way through to helping to support firm to build out elements of the risk management framework, supporting risk workshops, which is something that not many people enjoy doing because it can be quite challenging if you've not got the right approach to it, all the way through to reviewing board submissions and outputs. We've worked on that previously, and I say any element of it we can certainly employ our experience in.
We absolutely can. And one of the first steps perhaps in that journey is for firms to engage us to conduct a health check or an audit, and throughout that process the scope will evolve. And if risk management and risk management frameworks is in an area of particular focus, then we've got a tailored framework that we can employ to support firms with that.
Yeah, certainly we've got 3 years of experience, a good practice example of a full risk management framework, and we use that really not to suggest that firms take on that full framework. It may be relevant for certain firms, but actually there will certainly be elements in there. And we talked about risk language earlier, and to some people that doesn't really mean a lot at times, but when you see a good practice example of a risk language or risk taxonomy, as the technical specialists might call it, it just helps simplify your understanding of what a risk is, what category it might fall into, how to articulate a risk. So we've got some really good examples, I think, of good practice frameworks for that.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. I think we've probably spoken about risk management frameworks and operational resilience for long enough today. But obviously, as you've heard, it's a topic that we can delve into in some considerable detail. So if you do want to find out more about how UKGI can support us, you can contact us via the usual links. And other than that, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I hope that was helpful. And yeah, as Dave said, we can certainly help with any need, whether it be small or large. We're here to help.
Thank you for joining me. I'm sure I'll get you on for another one in the future.